All right, if you're watching us on playback right now, you can see our Substack. And I'm going to go to the chat, and hopefully this shares our screen, and go to these questions that were submitted to us. And the first one that we are going to get to is from Rich. And it says, now with the season coming to an end, how do you guys feel about Brandon Miller? I think your consensus was to take Scoot, but I always thought Miller had a lot more upside for us as a true 3 or a big 2. And like his favorite player, he is smooth like Paul George. So, loyal listener here, Rich asked this question. I think in most situations, Brian, like you have to wait 2 to 3 seasons before you make any definitive claims on rookies and like their status in the NBA. But I do believe the Hornets made the right decision. Just looking at it right now, I think out of the 4 of us, I was probably the least committed to Scoot. But I think a lot of that had to do with my lack of knowledge, like just not having a full picture on Scoot, not having a full picture on Miller. I didn't want to commit one way or the other. But it is interesting to see how like the fan base has, there was a portion of the fan base that wanted Scoot, and now they've kind of rallied behind Miller. And I really haven't been keeping close tabs on the Blazers or Scoot, but you can kind of just take a quick glance at some of his counting numbers and his shooting efficiency numbers, and that it hasn't been awesome. Like it hasn't been great. And then Miller, on the other hand, has like steadily improved throughout the season. He's always been in the conversation for like a top 3, top 5 rookie in the NBA. And he's won multiple Eastern Conference Rookie of the Month awards, which really hasn't been in the conversation for Scoot at all. But before we get deeper on Brandon Miller, the player, Brian, what do you think about having conversations, evaluating rookies, and kind of making declarations now versus 2 years from now? Like, is this a fair conversation to have right now?
I think it's fair with the sort of like obvious caveat that you just applied, which is that like more information will be better, and we'll know more once these guys have played another 100 more NBA games. Because evaluating someone like Scoot is tough right now. Like he's a teenage point guard on a really bad team, in a team that the Hornets sort of like end to end handled a couple of weeks ago. And a team that just, I don't know, still sort of like looking for a direction. It feels like there's going to have to be some big changes there before they sort of like set course. And yeah, it's been a tough season for Scoot. I wish he could have played in that game against the Hornets, because I haven't had the chance to like see a full game of
Right.
his much this season. And yeah, it's like going back to the Scoot Miller debate, Rich is right. I preferred Scoot as a prospect, and thought actually that there were some ways for Miller and Henderson, or pardon me, Henderson and LaMelo to fit together. And I was very high on Scoot, and I will say, like, I think he's underwhelmed a little bit this season. I still long term am going to remain optimistic on him becoming a good NBA player. But and Miller's a little bit older too, so like he's just sort of like ahead of the curve. But this is not, Brandon Miller didn't get dropped into an unbelievably good situation. Like the Hornets have been a mess, this year too, and he hasn't lost the plot at all. So like and he's continued to be good. He's gotten better in a lot of ways. And I'm excited. I want to talk more sort of about Miller's game, but just to answer your question, I think it's fair to do now. But like, if anyone is out there like planting a flag to say that like they were definitively right about something, and that like the word is final, like you just gotta be careful, because like there's plenty of basketball. These guys have their entire careers ahead of them. In the next couple of years, there's gonna be a lot of changes. There's gonna be growth. It's not all linear. So I still remain optimistic on Scoot. I don't want to write him off. Again, playing on quite possibly the worst team in the league, maybe outside of the Pistons, as a very young point guard, and he's dealt with injuries. So like it's tough to put too much weight onto his season. But so maybe like I don't feel great about like evaluating Scoot at this point, but someone like Miller, I think there's a decent amount of data to suggest that like the Hornets really have something going forward, and not just like a nice player to have, like maybe you felt after they drafted PJ in 2019, but like truly like foundational player with like superstar upside. And I think it's hard even for those who are like were skeptical of Miller or concerned with him. I wouldn't have described myself as a skeptic because I still thought of him as like a top 4 or 5 prospect in the draft. But I think he's at this point he has to have exceeded everyone's expectations so far this season, maybe outside of his own. So I don't know. How do you feel if I turn the question on you, Richie? How do you feel about sort of like evaluating guys at this stage of their career?
Yeah, I think. Can you hear me all right, by the way?
Mhm.
Okay, because I exited the stage. Okay. Yeah, I think overall, this is not the point to make that declaration, but I do think at this point, like I can definitively say that the Hornets made the best decision they could. Brandon Miller's averaging 17 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 1 steal, 49% on twos, 37% on threes. And I think we always knew that Brandon Miller was the guy that was more like NBA ready right now. And the draw with Scoot was the fact that he had potential. He had a little bit more runway to work with, or he needed more runway to work with. So I think evaluating Scoot, you're going to have to wait. I think Brandon Miller has actually, provided some things that I did not think he would provide this early on in the year. And I do want to mention, I know you've talked about this before. We've talked about it before about having more guys that can handle the ball, more guys that can be rim pressure guys. And I think that was kind of the draw with Scoot Henderson, about a guy that can just get downhill and especially like playing with LaMelo, playing off of LaMelo, playing in the second unit. But to Rich's point in the question, when you think about some of the star players around the league historically, they're like typically bigger wings. They're forwards out of that position. Now, you never draft a guy because of a specific position, but I think developing a guy that has size, that has some playmaking ability is a huge plus. So I think Brandon already has that, and obviously Scoot will never get to the same
Yeah.
size
The
as Brandon.
the the thing that I was really in on with Scoot was just like the rim pressure. And,
Right.
and I know that that hasn't, I mean, he, last season with the Ignite, he took a lot of mid-range shots. I sort of, in my scouting of him, thought that was him just trying to, work on something, sort of like knowing that the rim pressure component was like a bankable thing for him. I just haven't seen him enough at Portland to know like what that's looked like. I feel like he's popped up and had a couple of big games. Maybe he's not quite in this. I think these alarms were being sound even prior to the draft, where like maybe he wasn't quite as athletic as some of like the S tier, point guard athlete, athletes that have come into the league the last, 5, 6 season, year Morant's, like those types of players. He wasn't quite as, north south explosive and fast as those guys. And so, yeah, I think the things that I underrated with Miller, like to me, he felt like very scalable and like a plug and play guy, and someone that I thought had the chance to be in the NBA and like a contributor, 2-way player, a starter for a long time. But it's the creative, it's the off bounce scoring of his game that has just been better than I anticipated. And the pacing, the timing. To me, there was just stuff that it felt like you could kind of get in his jersey and bother him at Alabama last season. And that does happen some this year. We've talked,
Yeah.
Richie. You and I did a big scouting video pod on Brandon a couple of months ago. And, he still needs to get stronger. I don't know if he's ever going to be like a rim pressure guy, but when we're talking like, archetypal, like scoring 2-way wings that don't necessarily pressure the rim, like I think that's a super duper important player type to have. Like, and the reason why I always like worried about the Paul George comparisons is because one, Paul George was an incredible athlete when he got into the NBA. I think Miller's a very good athlete, maybe not the Paul George pre injury type of athlete, but George is just like the best version of that. Like Paul George has been a top 10 player in the NBA for a decade, basically, like give or take. And so to project that on a 20-year-old, after one season of college ball, just like it to me, it felt tough. It was just like, yeah, if everything goes right, best case scenario. The thing I used when we were doing the video pod was he does strike me as someone that's watched a lot of Paul George and sort of like tried to model his game in that direction. And that makes him a really interesting player for a lot of reasons beyond just like the, oh, is he ever as good as Paul George? Because like what it means is he's now has a really scalable and malleable game where you can see him. They use him every way offensively except for like posting up. He does basically everything. You can play him off the ball. You can run pick and roll. They're using him more as a screener now in the pick and roll. And that's working in a lot of different ways. I can't wait to see that more with LaMelo next season, or him setting off ball screens to get Mark Williams lobs, like that type of stuff.